Ahoy! In my recent videos about other topics, a lot of you have been asking about my Throwing Hatchet build, I guess because it does a fair bit of damage. That build actually was a bit of an experiment because I was trying to figure out how to deal the most damage possible while using a Throwing Hatchet. And I have now tested a variety of different versions and have found the one that I think works the best for me at least. I'm going to share with you multiple different options that I tried, and we'll talk about the skill tree, important weapon perks that you need, and so on. While this build could technically also be used in PvP, I used this as a PvE build first. I mainly got into this build because of Ennead, because in Ennead you have the last boss and the first one of those has that charge attack after which there is fire on the floor around him. You can, if perfectly spaced, place it in a particular place that you still can attack with melees, but especially in pugs, or if it doesn't work out perfectly, that is often not the case. So as a melee you're kind of just sitting around, and I figured I still want to do damage when that's the case, so I want to be able to use something else, and I landed on the Throwing Hatchet, and actually found that my damage could almost keep up with my melee damage because I could just ignore all the mechanics and have no downtime on my DPS, so overall the damage outcome should be almost the same. After that I started using the Throwing Hatchet in a lot more different places as well, whenever there was a mechanic that I needed to avoid and just had a brief downtime on my melee damage. So now let's look at the skill tree, starting with the Berserker side. The first skill you want to have is Enraged Strikes. This gives you 20% more damage on your basic attacks against targets below 30% health. Now I'll be saying, Duke, why would you want to have basic attack damage when you're throwing hatchets? Because the hatchets count as basic attacks in many situations, and for this passive they do. You can see that here. After I get the target down below 30% health, they take extra damage. This is obviously a lot more noticeable on bosses. So a very nice damage bonus. Another nice perk to have is Accumulated Power, which gives you an Empower after 3 successful light attacks or aimed throws, giving you a 20% damage increase for 3 seconds or until the next attack. It's not super important because it's just for one attack, but it is a nice bonus to have. We can also use Berserk, which will increase our Thrown Hatchet damage as well. This is one of the options, I'll get back to that later. Not necessarily a must for all builds though. Now you could push further down the skill tree, but you'd have to pick up a lot of perks that don't really benefit you because they're either just close range or just on heavy attacks. You could eventually end up at Frenzied Purge, and technically you could get all the way down to Defy Death, but what you'd have to do in order to achieve that is you would basically have to level Berserk and then go down at least halfway to Berserk as well, just to get this perk. If you are that type of person and you want to play with Defy Death, I wouldn't really go for a full Throwing Hatchet build. At that point, I feel like you're better off doing a mixed build where you have some throwing skills, but mainly rely on melee attacks on the hatchet still, because you're investing a ton of points on the wrong side essentially just to get Defy Death. I personally don't like using Defy Death as a crutch. I know it's very effective in some situations against bosses, but in my opinion, it is not ideal when I'm looking for a lot of DPS, and that's what I'm doing with my Throwing Hatchet. If you want to rely on that crutch, that's up to you, but again, you're going to sacrifice a lot to get there. Instead, let's move on to the right side. Talk about the perks here first and then the abilities. The first perk that you obviously want is Aimed Throw. No explanation needed, this is a Throwing Hatchet build. The next perk that's very nice is Critical Throw. This increases your critical chance of all range attacks by 10%, so at least in PvE I would say this is pretty much a must. With the right build you can pretty much get to almost 100% crit chance on the hatchet, so you want to get all the perks that help with that in my opinion. Likewise, you want to get on fire in the next row in my opinion. Every third Thrown Hatchet is a guaranteed critical hit. Again, you're already getting a very high crit chance, but guaranteed crit is still better than that, and you're getting them quite often. Rejuvenating crits is also nice to have. This gives you 10 stamina back with critical hits on aimed throws, and you're constantly going to be critting. Now, there's a downside with that. You don't want to slot a gem that gives you extra damage for not having full stamina when you're using this. And generally speaking, I feel like if you're already at range, you're not really using that much stamina most of the time anyways. So I would say that in terms of overall benefit, this isn't the most important perk. It's a nice one if you want to slot it in though, if you want to dodge a little bit more while you're throwing stuff anyways. But generally speaking, you're not dodging that much, so it's not that important. Then in the next row we have Refreshing Throws. Thrown hatchets that hit a target with an active debuff reduce all hatchet cooldowns by 5%. And this includes thrown hatchets from abilities. So throwing abilities or throwing hatchets from abilities reduces other abilities cooldowns. So it's a constant loop of everything reducing your cooldowns heavily. And this is very, very noticeable when it comes to your throwing hatchet rotations. So you should absolutely get this one. In the next row we have Exploitation. All attacks deal 10% additional damage to targets with an active debuff. You're constantly gonna have at least one debuff on the enemy. In PvE there will also be debuffs from other players, so yes, you wanna have this. Hurling Force in the next row is something you absolutely want. You get up to 20% extra damage from throwing hatchets if the target is 20 meters or further away. So you want to keep your distance while using the throwing hatchet, don't get too close in order to get the maximum benefit out of this, and you absolutely want to spec into this. Adrenaline Rush is a bit of a filler in my opinion. Dodging within 2 seconds of hitting a target with an ability consumes 25% less stamina. You're constantly going to get this effect, but again, you're not really gonna run out of stamina anyways, at least not in PvE, so this and rejuvenating crits are kinda okay, yeah, I guess we get even more stamina, but not super important in my eyes if you want to skip them in favor of something else. Thing is, there is not that much else that you could spec in anyways. The last perk, Persistent Hindrance, is an absolute no-brainer. This extends all debuff durations from hatchet debuffs by 20% when hitting a target with a thrown hatchet, so that's what you're constantly doing anyways. Also, all attacks deal 3% additional damage per debuff on the target, and this seems to also affect debuffs that are not from the hatchet, so probably also debuffs from other players, so you are gonna get a lot of extra damage from this alone. And that brings us to the abilities and the upgrades. The first one of those is Rending Throw, which is absolutely necessary. Super short cooldown, deals 110% weapon damage, and applies a rend, so really no reason not to get this. This is just a 10% rend, not the highest in the game, but super quick and easy to apply, so still very useful, even if you're using this as an offhand, just quickly switching over to it while you're fighting in melee, using the Rending Throw and switching back. The first upgrade, Targeted Impact, increases the rend duration by 4 seconds if the target is further than 6 meters away. Not super important because you can always refresh this in time anyways, but can be nice when you're using it while engaging. The next upgrade, Opportunistic, however, is very important, so we need the previous one, because this gives us 20% additional damage when hitting a target with an active debuff, which in group PvE is pretty much all of the time, and you also have other debuffs to apply this, and this also works in the sense that you can use Rending Throw again after using it, and the first rend applied counts as a debuff to amplify the damage of this one. The last perk here is Second Wind. If Rending Throw hits a target with an active debuff, its cooldown is reduced by 20%. In PvE, absolutely, why not? The second ability is Social Distancing. Throw a hatchet up to 25 meters forward and dodge backwards to get brief iframes, as well as a stagger on the target, dealing 100% weapon damage and inflicting a 25% slow for 5 seconds. It's alright. The problem with this ability is that currently it has a very long post animation. So long in fact that it can kind of almost cost you DPS depending on how cleanly you cancel into it. However, next patch this is getting buffed and you can use it without jumping backwards, like you can for example use the Blunderbuss net shot. Then this will be much less of a problem, there will be much less downtime afterwards and it will likely be a direct DPS increase. If you want to skip any of the throwing abilities in PvE, this would be the one. In PvP you probably want this one because it gives you a lot of extra mobility and survivability. The first upgrade, Quick Power, gives you haste. This is a nice bonus, it's just a 20% haste when you hit a target with an active debuff. I like using this when I don't have any other points to spend anywhere because having a little bit of extra mobility to avoid attacks without having to go out of the throwing stance essentially can be nice. The last upgrade is Stay Back. This is very nice in PvP because it applies a 1-second route to targets further than 6 meters away. In PvE, pretty much no value in this in my opinion. I don't see any situation where you want to route a single target. Doesn't increase your damage or anything else, so not really worth investing into. The third throw is Infected Throw. This one has a fairly long cooldown as well, but deals 120% weapon damage and is a very quick and effective cancel these days. It used to be slower, but now it's very, very good. It also applies a 30% disease to the target and a 10% weaken, so they heal less and deal less damage. And unlike what the in-game description says, this is actually for 5 seconds, not for 10 seconds without any further upgrades. The first upgrade is Mortal Power, and this is what actually gives you 10% duration, but only when hitting targets which are below 50% health. This also only applies on direct hits and not from the AoE cloud. This is an important perk to have if you actually care about the debuff, especially the weaken aspect. And speaking of the cloud, the second upgrade is Aerial Transmission, which creates a 3-meter radius disease and weakened cloud that lasts for 6 seconds. This doesn't extend the duration, however, if a mob is already afflicted by the initial hit, so this is just an AoE to hit surrounding mobs, which can be nice in dungeons, especially for the weaken, or if there is a particular healing effect on mobs. So the first option to spec would be like this. We're leaving out the upgrades of social distancing here because they're not super important for us, and just fully commit to the throwing tree as well as the extra damage that we can get from the Berserker tree. Variation that I prefer for PvE is this. I get the extra movement speed from social distancing, just 20% movement speed here, and I take out the reduced stamina cost from Adrenaline Rush, because I don't really need it. I have a dex build for the hatchet, so I have enough stamina as is. I get stamina back from this. I don't care about getting even more stamina or losing a little bit less stamina overall, so I like this a little bit better. If you go for a PvP variation, you could technically go for this if you say I don't care that much about extra crit chance because everyone's running Resilient anyways. Now the problem is, you're gonna run rejuvenating crits because the point has to go somewhere and you're gonna get less crits. So the benefit is somewhat debatable at that point. Alternatively, this is a good option in my opinion. Infected Throw, if you're not focused on anti-healing large groups of people, should be very effective if it's just single target focused. So this is something that for PvP, in my opinion, would also work decently well and still give you a lot of extra damage, even if you want to use it in PvE in between. And last but not least, there is also the option to go into Berserk and skip social distancing. There's a lot of flexibility here in how exactly you do that. You could just put that 1 point into Berserk for the extra damage, if that's all you care about. Then you have the extra point to put into Adrenaline Rush. Or you could put an extra point in here and get the extra movement speed while berserking, which I would probably prefer. You can go even further and say I want to commit some less points to the throwing tree and just go deeper into berserk so that you can cleanse yourself with that as well. You could technically take out even more in order to get uninterruptible berserk, but I wouldn't really do that. You could, for example, take the point out of second wind, or you could take any other beneficial point away really, but I would say that this is as far as I would commit into berserk, and normally you're okay just having a single point in it. And when it comes to weapon perks, there is only one that you really need, for PvE at least, but that one is very important. So important in fact that I would recommend putting it on a weapon because it is a major factor in your damage, and that is Empowering Rending Throw. This gives you 30% extra damage for any ranged hatchet attack against a Rending Throw target. Since you're gonna have constant uptime on Rending Throw, this is extremely effective to get a massive damage increase all of the time. And this is the highest on weapon, and since I don't really see much of a reason to get much else on the weapon, this is the perk that I would prioritize. Along with that, I would get a Bane perk. There are obviously third perks that you could get, like for example Vorpal for headshot damage, but generally speaking, I found none of them important enough to prioritize them either over Rending Throw or over the correct type of Bane. Realistically, having those two perks should be enough for very effective damage output in most situations. Everything else is a bonus. Other damage perks are simply less reliable. For example, Vorpal can give you very good damage against targets that you can headshot, but not every target can be headshot effectively. The most effective increased damage perk if you have infinite money would actually be Attunement. Fortunately, since we only have two perks that are really important, these can be rolled very easily with a Scarab, and some of them also drop from specific dungeons. When it comes to gem choices, I normally recommend Opal, but in this case I would actually recommend Diamond instead. This gives you 15% extra damage while at full health, and since you are at range, you're gonna be at full health most of the time. Of course, you could also go the elemental gem route, but that also puts you at risk of the gem not working effectively if it's a specific elemental weak that counters it. If you want to Runeglass your weapon as well, then take a damage over time Runeglass. Another piece of gear that can be very useful is a ring with extra slash damage, since the thrown hatches actually count as slash damage. Other than that, most of the perks aren't really directly relevant for your damage in PvE. Of course, having some extra refreshing perks on your armor can also increase your damage further. When it comes to attribute point distribution, I would make that more depend on your primary weapon. In my case, the primary weapon is the Greatsword, so I'm somewhat flexible between my points in strength and dexterity. If you have a weapon that only scales with one of them, that is obviously what you want to prioritize, because the throwing hatchet will be your offhand. I've kind of moved away from recommending very specific point loadouts because I noticed when I'm in dungeons and I have to switch gear for specific bosses and so on, my attribute points change a little bit all the time anyways, so I find that relying on a very precise point distribution is ineffective for me personally. What I will say is that quite a few of the useful points for the Throwing Hatchet are in the dexterity tree. For example, the 10% chance to critically hit at 50 points, and also dodges costing 10 less stamina, which I think is just generally a useful perk to have. An especially nice perk is also the 200 dex perk, which gives you 10% extra headshot damage, but again, not that useful on all bosses. You also see that the 250 dex perk, which gives you 10% bonus damage against CC'd enemies, stunned, slowed, or rooted, and the 200 strength perk that does a similar thing, don't really benefit you that much most of the time because most bosses cannot be stunned, slowed, or rooted, so these are kind of outlier cases where they actually increase your damage. As such, if you do a reasonable split of, say for example, 200 strength, 200 dex, and the rest in con, that'll work well for most situations. More exact splits should depend more on your main weapon than on your throwing hatchet. Speaking of main weapon, if you want to learn more about my greatsword build, then I will link my advanced greatsword guide right here that goes more in depth on that. But there's one more thing that we need to talk about. One interesting question that I got was, what's better, having 3 different throws or having Berserk in 2 throws, since Berserk also increases the damage of your throws? I had my ideas about this, but I actually wanted to test it with some clean slate builds. What I did was I got all the numbers for the different damage values all as crits, because most of the time you will be critting anyways, and I tested how long it would take to use Berserk and then have the entire uptime as well as the downtime of Berserk until I can use Berserk again, because that is the time frame that I can directly compare to then just using the Thrown Hatchet's abilities over and over on the other side. In both cases you can do around 16 normal hatchet throws. This is because Berserk has a slight delay afterwards unless you cancel it, but if you cancel it you can't do it with a Thrown Hatchet as far as I'm aware, at least it doesn't work consistently, whereas on the other side you have social distancing, which has a delay after it twice, so all around the throws are pretty much the same. Then you can get 4 Rending Throws in, though the first one doesn't benefit from all the other buffs yet because it's thrown as the first ability, so the second one and so on will be stronger. You get 2 social distancing in if you have that ability, and 2 infected throws. If you're using Berserk, 7 of your normal throws and 2 of your Rending Throws will happen while Berserk is on cooldown and you don't get the extra damage. With all the cooldown reduction from the throwing trees, I was able to have 12 seconds of Berserk duration with 9 seconds downtime. What we see here is the total damage output of both. On the left side we have the total damage from just using different throws, which is 69,024. And on the right side we have using Berserk and 2 throws, being Infected Throw and Rending Throw, with 66,861 damage. So as you can see, having these extra throws from social distancing actually gives us a significant damage increase overall, even though the raw damage from the right-click throw is a little bit lower. The 3 throws build will also be buffed further in the next patch when social distancing has less of a post animation and you can use it without jumping backwards. The triple throw build also has other benefits, namely more cooldown reduction due to having 3 different throws that you can use to reduce your cooldowns further, so in the long run this would actually be a slight advantage, and it also doesn't require you to stay on the hatchet for as long. It kind of feels wasted if you're in Berserk and you have to switch back to your other weapon, so you kind of want to stick to it, whereas with the Throwing Hatchet build that's less of an issue and you can switch back and forth depending on what the mob you're fighting is doing much more easily. On the other hand, you obviously sacrifice the benefits of Berserk like health regeneration, not being staggered if you're using it in melee, and potentially also getting the Defy Death passive if you're fully investing into left side, but again, not a throwing build in my opinion. If you're interested in more Throwing Hatchet talk, Runeglass info and more, then please consider subscribing and clicking the bell, because those are some of the things I'm working on at the moment. Thanks for watching, DukeSloth, out.